In less than 1 century, the United States has used crisis to legally override private ownership more than once. Not through force, not through collapse, but through structure. In 1933, a single executive order transformed privately held gold into government-controlled assets almost overnight. There were no tanks in the streets, no suspension of daily life. Banks opened, stores functioned, factories continued operating. On the surface, the country appeared intact. Yet, beneath that appearance, the rules of ownership had shifted. The danger is not that this happened once. The danger is that the framework that made it possible was never removed. History shows that systems of power rarely disappear when they fail. They survive by reorganizing. They abandon visible forms and preserve underlying mechanisms. When pressure builds, when debt expands beyond what trust can support, the system does not surrender control. It refines it. This is not a story about collapse. It is a story about continuity. If you want to understand how gold is used to redistribute assets during the next crisis, this channel is built for that purpose. Every major financial crisis begins with the same condition. Confidence weakens. Paper claims grow faster than real value. Institutions that once appeared solid begin relying on reassurance rather than strength. At that point, the system faces a decision: allow fragmentation to continue or restructure control before confidence fully breaks. The pattern repeats. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, financial panics moved through the United States with alarming speed. These were not abstract market events. They were physical experiences. People stood in long lines outside banks, waiting to exchange promises for something tangible. They were not investors. They were depositors, shop owners, workers, families trying to protect what little stability remained. When banks failed to meet those demands, trust failed with them. During the Great Depression, this process reached a breaking point. Thousands of banks closed, credit froze, unemployment surged to levels previously unseen. Confidence did not erode slowly, it collapsed. And when confidence collapses, behavior changes. People stop thinking in terms of yield or opportunity. They think in terms of preservation. Assets that depend on institutional promises lose appeal. Assets that exist outside those promises gain importance. During the early 1930s, gold moved out of circulation and into private hands, not as speculation, as protection. This movement was not driven by panic buying or market enthusiasm. It was driven by memory. People remembered previous panics. They remembered banks closing without warning. They remembered paper claims becoming inaccessible. Gold did not depend on reassurance. It did not require confidence in a balance sheet. It simply existed. That shift in behavior mattered because systems built on trust cannot function when trust drains away. And when enough people attempt to step outside the system at the same time, the system responds. Not with force, with rules. The official explanation in 1933 was stabilization. Emergency conditions required extraordinary measures. Confidence needed to be restored. Economic recovery needed coordination. Those explanations were not false. They were incomplete. What mattered was not the stated intention. What mattered was the mechanism. Gold ownership was redefined. What had been lawful became restricted. What had been private became conditional. This did not happen through sudden disruption. It happened through administrative order. Daily life continued. Wages were paid. Transactions occurred. Yet the foundation beneath ownership had shifted. History shows that this is how durable systems operate under stress. They avoid visible rupture. They preserve continuity. They keep institutions functioning while quietly changing the boundaries of control. The financial structure that absorbed gold in 1933 did not disappear once the immediate crisis passed. It remained embedded within legal, regulatory, and monetary architecture. And that matters, because when later crises emerged, the question was no longer whether such control was possible. The question was how efficiently it could be applied. This is where the story moves beyond in a single moment, beyond a single order, beyond a single decade. What happened during the Great Depression was not an exception. It was a demonstration that ownership could be redefined during crisis without dismantling the system itself. Once that boundary had shifted once, it never fully returned to its original position. This is the starting point, not of collapse, but of pattern. In the next phase, the changes become less visible, more procedural, more normalized. And it is there, in that quiet shift, that the structure reveals itself. What followed was not a sudden tightening of daily life. It was a subtle shift in rules. The crisis did not end overnight, but the language surrounding it began to change. Emergency measures became administrative routines. Temporary controls settled into policy. What had been justified as an exception slowly became normalized. This is how durable systems stabilize themselves. They do not announce transformation. They implement adjustment. In 1933, the executive order did not frame gold as an enemy. It framed it as a risk to recovery. Private accumulation was presented as a threat to stability, not because gold was dangerous in itself, but because it existed outside coordinated control. The message was consistent. Economic recovery required alignment. Fragmentation had to be reduced. Individual actions had to yield to collective management. The legal language was precise. Ownership was not eliminated. It was restricted, regulated, and reclassified. Gold could still exist, but only within newly defined boundaries. Compliance became the mechanism. There was no need for enforcement spectacle. The structure relied on participation. Financial institutions acted as intermediaries. Reporting requirements created visibility. Penalties ensured consistency. What mattered was not how many people resisted. What mattered was how many complied. History shows that when rules change quietly, compliance rises, especially when daily life appears uninterrupted. Banks reopened, transactions resumed, wages were paid, the system appeared functional. But beneath that appearance, options were narrowing. The ability to move wealth outside institutional channels diminished. The pathways that once allowed individuals to step away from paper claims grew constrained. This was not unique to gold. It reflected a broader shift in how financial control operated during stress. When trust weakens, systems do not tolerate exits. They close them. Not through bans alone, through procedure, reporting thresholds, licensing requirements, conditional permissions. Each measure appears limited when viewed in isolation. Together, they reshape behavior. Gold ownership moved from a private decision to a regulated condition. Holding it carried administrative consequences. Transacting with it became visible. This was not framed as punishment. It was framed as responsibility. And responsibility, once defined by the system, becomes difficult to contest. As the immediate crisis faded, these changes remained in place. They were no longer discussed as emergency tools. They were absorbed into the operating framework. This is a critical moment in the sequence. Because systems rarely reverse control mechanisms once introduced, they repurpose them. The architecture that managed gold during the Depression did not disappear. It evolved. Over time, it influenced how other assets were monitored, how capital flows were observed, how compliance became embedded in financial life. The shift was not ideological, it was structural. Rules replaced discretion, procedures replaced negotiation, and once control is procedural, it becomes durable. This is why history matters, not as nostalgia, as reference, because when later crises emerged, the system did not need to invent new responses. It adapted existing ones. The language changed, the tools modernized, the logic remained. When instability threatens confidence, systems seek consolidation. They prefer coordination over fragmentation, visibility over opacity. Gold was simply the first clear demonstration. It showed that private assets could be drawn back into the system without dismantling daily life. That ownership could be conditioned rather than abolished. That compliance could replace confrontation. This is the shift most people miss, not because it is hidden, but because it is gradual. Nothing dramatic signals the transition. There is no single moment of rupture. The rules change, Life continues, and by the time the pattern becomes visible, the structure is already in place. This is not about intent. It is about design. Systems that survive repeated crises do so by refining control, not surrendering it. They reduce the number of paths available, they simplify outcomes, and they do it quietly. The next phase follows naturally from this shift. Once exits are limited, the system no longer needs to persuade. It can redirect, and that redirection is where the sequence becomes unmistakable. Once exits narrow, the system no longer relies on persuasion. It relies on sequence. This is the point where control becomes visible, not as an announcement, but as an outcome. When ownership is conditioned and movement is monitored, assets begin to flow in predictable directions, not because people are forced individually, but because alternatives quietly disappear. During the years surrounding the Depression, gold did not vanish. It changed position. Private holdings declined. Official reserves expanded. This shift did not require mass confrontation. It required alignment. Gold was exchanged at fixed terms defined by the system. Paper claims replaced physical custody. What had once existed outside institutional balance sheets moved inside them. This was not framed as loss. It was framed as participation in recovery. People did not experience this moment as confiscation. They experienced it as obligation. The distinction matters. History shows that systems function most effectively when individuals believe they are complying voluntarily. When choices exist in theory, but not in practice. At the individual level, the experience was quiet, a form completed, a transaction processed, a receipt issued. At the structural level, something larger was taking place. Real assets were being consolidated, paper claims were being distributed. This exchange reshaped the balance between private ownership and institutional control. And once completed, it could not be reversed without disrupting the entire system. This is the moment where recognition begins, not recognition by policymakers, recognition by history, because this same sequence appears whenever financial stress reaches a certain intensity. First, trust weakens, then alternatives are restricted, then assets migrate toward centralized custody. The process does not require intent to repeat. It repeats because it works. Once assets are absorbed into the system, they can be used to stabilize it. They can anchor confidence. They can support expansion, but that expansion does not occur symmetrically. After gold moved into official control, its role changed. It no longer served individual preservation. It served systemic balance. Paper claims increased. Currency supply expanded. Credit slowly returned. On the surface, recovery appeared underway, but purchasing power told a different story. Those holding paper assets experienced erosion over time, not abruptly, gradually. Those holding control over hard reserves experienced something else: flexibility. This was not accidental, it was mechanical. Once gold was consolidated, its valuation could be adjusted, not immediately, when conditions allowed. This adjustment did not require public debate. It required authority. When the price of gold was later reset, the shift had already occurred. Private holders were no longer positioned to benefit. The system was. This is the core of the sequence. Assets move first, revaluation follows, and the timing ensures that benefits accrue to those already inside the structure. This does not mean the system fails. It means it stabilizes, and stabilization always involves trade-offs. The economy resumed function. Production increased, employment improved. But the distribution of control had changed. This is why the story does not end with recovery, because once a mechanism proves effective, it does not disappear. It becomes part of the toolkit. Later, crises did not need to repeat the exact steps. They adapted them. Different assets, different instruments, same logic. Visibility increases, mobility decreases, centralization expands. History shows this pattern across periods and regions, not as conspiracy, as design. The lesson is not moral, it is structural. Systems prioritize continuity, over individual positioning. They seek stability before fairness. They consolidate before they fragment. And once assets are absorbed into the system, they are no longer neutral. They become tools, tools for reassurance, tools for expansion, tools for managing confidence. This is the point where the sequence can no longer be seen as isolated events. It becomes recognizable as a pattern that does not depend on ideology, or personality, or era, only on pressure. And when pressure returns, the sequence activates, not dramatically, not violently, predictably. This is where the framework becomes visible, not because it is named, but because it repeats. At this stage, the sequence no longer needs to be inferred. It can be named, not as a theory, as a structure. History shows that when financial pressure reaches a certain threshold, the response follows a consistent order. Crisis weakens confidence. Rules shift quietly. Assets consolidate. Value is recalibrated. Each step appears rational on its own. Together, they form a system. This system does not emerge from ideology. It emerges from necessity. When trust can no longer support expanding claims, the system must secure something more durable, something that does not depend on belief. Gold historically served that function. Once consolidated, it allowed monetary expansion without immediate collapse. It anchored confidence while paper claims multiplied. This is why the process is often misunderstood. Observers focus on outcomes, recovery, growth, stability. They miss the transfer that made those outcomes possible. After consolidation, revaluation becomes feasible, not because markets demand it, because control allows it. When the price of gold was adjusted upward after private ownership had been neutralized, the shift did not redistribute gains evenly. It rebalanced power. Those holding paper assets absorbed the adjustment through purchasing power. Those controlling reserves absorbed it through balance sheets. This is not exploitation, it is mechanics. The system functions by reallocating pressure. Stability is restored at the surface level. Control deepens beneath it. This creates the central tension. The system works. It delivers order after chaos. It prevents fragmentation. It restores functionality. But it does so by reshaping ownership and access. The individual experience remains largely uninterrupted. Daily life continues. Transactions occur. Institutions operate. The change is structural, not experiential. And that is precisely why it endures, because systems that demand visible sacrifice generate resistance. Systems that reallocate quietly generate compliance. Once this pattern is recognized, it becomes difficult to view subsequent crises as isolated events. Different decades, different instruments, same sequence. The language adapts, the tools modernize, the architecture remains. This is why the pattern survives. Leadership changes, political shifts, and institutional reforms. It is embedded in how crises are managed, not who manages them. Gold was not unique because of its symbolism. It was unique because of its position outside trust-based systems. That position made it both valuable and incompatible with expanding paper structures. The solution was not elimination, it was absorption. Once absorbed, gold ceased to function as an external check. It became an internal stabilizer. From that point forward, monetary expansion could proceed with greater flexibility. Debt could grow, confidence could be managed. The trade-off was subtle but lasting. Private autonomy over hard assets diminished. Institutional discretion expanded. This is not framed as loss because the system does not collapse. It improves. Living standards recover. Economic activity resumes. But the distribution of control has shifted. This is the moment where the pattern must be acknowledged fully, not as accusation, as observation. Every time a system faces a choice between fragmentation and consolidation, it chooses consolidation. Every time exits threaten stability, they are narrowed. Every time assets exist outside coordination, they are drawn inward. And every time revaluation occurs after consolidation, the benefits align with control. This does not require planning, cross generations. It requires structure. Structures persist because they solve recurring problems. This is why the framework did not disappear after the Depression. It did not need to. It had proven effective. Later periods would apply variations of the same logic, not always with gold, not always explicitly, but always with assets that matter during stress. Once the sequence is visible, it reframes how stability is understood. Stability is not the absence of change. It is the successful management of change. And management requires leverage. Gold provided that leverage when trust failed. Other mechanisms would follow when conditions evolved. The system does not fear crisis. It uses it, not to destroy itself, to reorganize. This is where the story must turn toward the present, not to predict, to orient. Because the value of recognizing a pattern lies not in forecasting outcomes, but in understanding position. And position is determined long before conclusions are drawn. The final step in recognizing any system is understanding where it places the present moment, not as a forecast, as orientation. History shows that patterns do not announce their return. They emerge quietly, using familiar language and familiar tools. What changes is not the sequence. What changes is the environment. Debt today expands at a scale unseen in earlier periods. Paper claims move faster than physical settlement. Confidence is managed continuously through reassurance rather than resolution. These conditions are not presented as emergencies. They are presented as normal. That distinction matters because the most effective crisis controls are not activated during panic. They are embedded long before panic arrives. This is why the question is never whether the system will repeat past actions exactly. It rarely does. The question is which elements of the sequence are already visible. Restrictions do not appear as prohibitions. They appear as safeguards, reporting, monitoring, coordination. Assets do not disappear. They change how they can move. Revaluation does not arrive as shock. It arrives as adjustment. And control does not present itself as domination. It presents itself as stability. This is how continuity operates. The system does not need collapse to reorganize. It requires imbalance. When obligations grow faster than trust can sustain, consolidation becomes preferable to fragmentation. This has been true across decades, across instruments, across monetary arrangements. Gold once occupied the center of this process because it sat outside institutional trust. When that position became incompatible with system stability, it was absorbed. The same logic applies whenever assets challenge coordination. The pattern does not depend on metal. It depends on pressure. Understanding this changes how history is read. Events that appear disconnected begin to align. Measures described as technical reveal strategic function. Stability narratives reveal redistribution mechanics. This does not imply inevitability. It implies structure. Structures do not decide outcomes. They shape possibilities, and within those possibilities, positioning matters, not positioning as speculation, positioning as awareness. The purpose of recognizing this pattern is not to provoke fear. Fear narrows judgment. The purpose is orientation. Once the sequence is visible, it becomes easier to identify which phase resembles the present most closely, not to predict what comes next, but to understand what conditions enable certain outcomes. History does not repeat because people choose to repeat it. The pattern repeats because the constraints remain. Confidence still matters. Trust still weakens under pressure. Assets still migrate toward coordination when fragmentation threatens stability. These dynamics are not ideological. They are operational, and they are most powerful when they feel ordinary. This is why crisis management rarely looks like crisis. It looks like administration. It looks like continuity. It looks like order preserved. The lesson history offers is not resistance or compliance, it is recognition. Recognition of sequence, recognition of timing, recognition of structure. Once seen, it cannot be unseen. Before this sequence activates fully, there is always a period where signals overlap, where reassurances coexist with restrictions, where stability narratives intensify. Those moments are not warnings, they are transitions. Understanding them does not require action, it requires clarity, and clarity is the only advantage history reliably provides. If you recognize this sequence forming again, not as a headline, but as a pattern, you already understand more than most. Leave a single word in the comments. Stage. It signals recognition, not agreement. And if you want to continue this analysis, the next chapter explores how gold has historically signaled systemic stress before formal crisis declarations. The pattern does not end, it continues, and once recognized, it changes how every future crisis is understood.